Hi, folks. Welcome to our weekly history chats. Rob Goller here. Thanks for joining me again. And as always, thanks for supporting this project. Much appreciated. And I'm very thankful for the feedback about local history. Today's topic comes from last week I was at 42 North, a local establishment here, where I was invited to talk about local history, particularly how East Aurora became East Aurora. Which I'll have more information about that later with some of the writings because the village is celebrating its 150th anniversary this summer. But one of the great questions, the best part of these events that I do is when it's open, the floor is open to questions, and I got a lot of really good questions. And one of the questions was about the role of women in politics, particularly local politics, even before they were granted the right to vote. And here in New York State, women gained the right to vote in 1917. We think about 1920 quite a bit because that's when the Constitution was changed nationwide. But here in New York State, after a few attempts, women were granted the right to vote by men who went to the polls and felt that it was, a good thing that women could vote. But before that, we sometimes get this idea in our head that women were not involved in politics, that because they couldn't vote, they weren't involved in politics. And except maybe the women's suffrage movement, where they were actually out there on the streets, literally, and in government buildings and petitioning and holding meetings to get the right to vote, the women's suffrage. But they were also very involved in politics, even though they couldn't vote in many other areas. And one of them in particular, and that's why I'm going to talk about this week with the topic, is that question at that forum last week gave me this idea of something I've been studying for a little bit, and that will be put into a written form sooner or later, about women's not only women's roles in politics before they gained the right to vote, but also the wet dry question. And they were very active. Women were very active in the prohibition movement, temperance movements here in our community and in communities across the country. And a prime example of women being involved in politics before they gained the right to vote was the 1890s, particularly the early 1900s. We had a town meeting. Actually, until 1901, the towns had a town meeting in March each year where they elected their town officials and voted on a variety of issues. They'd vote on the town budget, they would vote for town supervisor, town justices of the peace, and certain propositions that would come up. One of the big ones year after year, not only in the 1890s, but going into the 20th century, was whether or not our town, or in any town, actually all towns at one point or other voted on this, whether it should be wet or dry. Wet meaning allowing the sale of alcohol, or dry, not allowing the sale of alcohol. And of course, this is not a black-white issue. There were all sorts of nuances with the voting. So women, actually, there are reports in the newspaper where women showed up at the town meeting. And today, when you go to vote in town elections or any election for that matter, there's this perimeter of 100 feet. You'll see the signs, 100 feet from a polling station. And you're not allowed to campaign within that. They don't want people being pressured while they're going to vote or influenced while they're going to vote. All campaigning has to happen outside that 100-foot radius, which is why you often see candidates standing right at that line. Much different with the town meeting format, which we had till 1901, where all the men, women weren't voting yet, would go to this meeting and they would debate the issues. They would vote throughout the day on there would be a ballot, but on issues they would debate it, and it was actually allowed. Debate was seen as a good thing at the town meeting, and they would put up propositions, and they would debate face to face. The political parties would go off into their corners and come up with candidates. So it was a really active day politically, and debate was encouraged. Well, women came to those meetings, even though they couldn't vote at the ballot box. They came to the meetings, handed out leaflets, tried to influence the men who did have the right to vote. Most of the women were there to promote the dry propositions, meaning temperance or prohibition. and there's actually a prohibition party at the time, and they would try to influence the election by debating and by campaigning for their side, which was to not allow the sale of alcohol. So although women couldn't vote, they were really active in this effort. Probably more women in this effort than men. There were several men involved, and even some political leaders. There were some ministers from local churches that were involved in this movement. But yes, women were actively involved in this. Now, so each year, the election would have varying levels of turnout, numbers-wise, and you could count on when there was a year where the wet-dry question was on the ballot, you could count on being a big turnout for the election. On the one side, you had the campaign of against sale of alcohol, and on the other side, you had tavern owners and business owners in town who feared that by getting rid of the sale of alcohol, that it would impact commerce in our community. And of course, some folks had claimed that other towns that had gone dry actually prospered even more than the towns that remained wet. But so there was a debate back and forth, and it was such a divided community over this issue, so much so that in 1894, and I'm doing a ton of research on this, and there's a lot more details. I've written about it before about other with other aspects of voting, where the wet-dry question came in, but I'm still working on my research on that specific question and how it's impacted our community. But so far, what I found is some very interesting information. 1894 election, the difference was one vote. We remained wet, allowing alcohol by one vote, despite a very prominent and forceful campaign on the side of the dry side. Now, on the ballot wasn't wet or dry. Should we allow alcohol or shouldn't we at that point in 1890s? What was on the ballot, however, was what they called an excise commissioner. It was the commissioner who, or the license commissioner, as they would call them in different places. That was the person that you elected as a town official who would issue the licenses. And they had a lot of discretion over licenses that were issued. And so each side would put up a candidate, one who was in favor of license. So they would be on the side of yes, if someone were to apply for a liquor license, essentially an alcohol license, and that's what you had to do at the time, they were in favor of giving people the license. And some of those people may not have been in favor of the sale of alcohol, but they maybe felt that that it was at the individual's discretion, that the government shouldn't be deciphering that, to making a decision on that people should be able to do what they want. On the other side, there was a candidate for licensing commissioner who was the dry candidate, the no license, meaning they didn't want to give out licenses to people to sell alcohol. So in 1894, the candidate for license won by a single vote. Well, in the newspaper after the fact, the dry folks, the ministers and in town, they actually saw that as a victory, because for years they had been trying to promote this. There were the Women's Christian Temperance Societies. There were groups in town that did not want the sale of alcohol, and they had been working hard. So to lose by just one vote was seen as a victory. Well, the next year, they had the same vote at the town meeting in March 1895, and the dry folks, the no license folks, their candidate won by 91 votes, a lot relative to the number of people who voted. So we were essentially dry in East Aurora, which might be hard to imagine today, where we have no open container law, which I'll talk about in a bit. But from today, where we have bars and taverns all up and down Main Street, it's hard to imagine our community without the sale of alcohol. But that's what happened in 1895. No licenses would have been issued for the sale of alcohol. And so this was difficult for probably a tavern owner who it depended on one year to the next whether or not they would be able to sell alcohol, which might have been a difficult thing for them, not to know whether or not they'd be able to sell alcohol the next year. This issue was the one issue that also caused people to claim that they were ineligible voters showing up at the town meetings, and I wrote about this. They were thinking that people came from other towns to vote. They were trying to stuff the ballot box, essentially. And at some point, there were candidates. Back then, there was no voter registration list. You showed up at the meeting, and you had to swear that you were an eligible voter. And some of the voters, some of the men who came up to vote, when they got to the point of being asked to swear that they were, to attest that they were an actual legitimate voter, they couldn't do it. Their word meant something, and they couldn't do it. Because it would be perjury or against the law to say otherwise if you were not a voter. So there were some claims of that. And what led to that was this licensing question, and some tavern owners in town were accused of stuffing the ballot box. So this went back and forth for several years, and actually in 1915, 1916, we went dry again. I have to look into more of the back and forth of this, but I do know for about a little over a year in the 1915, 1916, we were dry again. And then in 1917, they brought it to the polls again, and this is where you actually went to the November election and voted yes or no whether you were wet or dry. There was no voting. It wasn't through a vote of a public official or the excise commissioner or the licensing commissioner. And they voted to go wet in 1917 so people could, taverns could sell alcohol again. One of the interesting things about the elections, though, the ballot propositions in this was they were divided out. So they divided out whether yes or no, whether or not certain establishments should be able to sell alcohol. So it wasn't across the board. So should taverns, only taverns, be able to sell alcohol? Hotels be able to sell alcohol, and stores would, and then they had a fourth category of pharmacies with a prescription for medicinal purposes. Now this sounds very familiar to the recreational marijuana propositions that have been on the ballots in many states, where there are certain categories that they were talking about whether or not they should be allowed, whether for medicinal purposes or whether a store or dispensary should be able to sell it. The same thing happened on the town ballot here in New York State, and probably other states as well, as where to allow it. So, but in 1917, the voters across the board here in this community voted to go wet. Well, what happened in 1920? Prohibition nationwide. So for a very long time, for more than a decade, the nation, through a constitutional amendment, was dry. That only led to bootleg alcohol, and even here in our own community, we have stories of illegal distilleries in basements of establishments on Main Street. Some can be confirmed, some are very iffy, the story, but we know it happened. Of course it did. But so Prohibition came along and got rid of all this question over whether or not a town could be wet or dry. When Prohibition went out in the 1930s, there were two establishments, at least in East Aurora, that quickly applied for a liquor license or an alcohol license. The Circle Inn, Harold's Circle Inn at the time, I believe, down at the West End, and then the Globe Hotel. Those two, there were public notices in the paper. So we know that there were establishments in town that wanted to sell alcohol legally, and we know through the liquor license process that they did it immediately right after Prohibition. And then after that, after Prohibition, I don't see anywhere where we were voting wet dry. There were our regulations, the blue laws we talked about a couple weeks ago about town regulating the times that you could purchase alcohol, but I don't see anywhere where alcohol was. We weren't voting on whether to make the whole town wet or dry. So that very interesting history about East Aurora, which today is hard to imagine that we would have been a dry town. Now, we are one of few communities, East Aurora is often talked about as one of few communities that doesn't have an open container law. You can essentially walk around the community in the village with a cup of beer or alcohol, and it does not violate the law. Of course, there's other laws that could come into play, disorderly conduct, things like that. And what happened there? It's not like there's a law on the books. No one in the village put a law on the books that says we will allow you to walk around the community with a cup of beer. What happened is there was never, after Prohibition, a lot of communities were putting laws into place prohibiting the sale of alcohol or open containers of alcohol. And from what I can tell, and I'm going to do more research on this, of course, because it's a question I get quite a bit, is that we didn't put a law in place to allow it. We just never put a law into place to disallow it. So the law does not exist on the books. So it's the opposite of what you would think. So the lack of a law, of an open container law, allows you to walk around with a beer. This has been debated over and over again whether we should have one. I'll leave that to the politicians and the local village board and those who want to take that up. But from a historical standpoint, East Aurora just never put a law on the books like many other communities, like a vast majority of communities. So many, in fact, that we were one of very few communities to not have an open container law. However, go back to 1890s, early 1900s, and for short spans of time, we were actually dry. And then, of course, during Prohibition, we were dry as well. So you would not have seen what you see today. 1920s, it's hard to imagine how long Prohibition lasts. 1920s into the 30s, there would have been hotels and establishments, but they wouldn't have been selling alcohol, restaurants. So just try to picture East Aurora without the corner bars and the taverns. It's interesting. It's just putting it in perspective. And then even before that, even before Prohibition, which would have been across the country, we were voting in the community to not allow the sale of alcohol just as the town of Aurora. So interesting history about alcohol in our community. Again, thank you for joining me. I hope you found that topic interesting, as much interesting as I did. The dry, wet vote, and the Prohibition movement was very big, and a lot of, to get back to the original question, is whether women were involved in politics. Very much so in this debate and in this question back in the 1890s. They were attending the meetings and trying to convince the men who did have the vote to vote against allowing the sale and consumption of alcohol. Again, thank you for joining me. I hope you found this interesting. And again, keep the comments coming. And again, I'm Rob Goller. And if you want to watch these videos not on Facebook, some people don't like Facebook, the video watching on Facebook, I do post them on my YouTube channel, Robert Lowell Goller, as well. Thank you again for listening, and thank you for keeping history alive, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.